Tara, I really appreciate you being here with me on the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation podcast, and specifically here for our series on the impact of fashion. So, for folks who are unfamiliar with you and the work that you do, would you mind introducing us?
Yeah, thank you, Corey, for having me. I'm Tara Donaldson. I'm the executive editor at WWD, where I've been for a little over a year. And prior to that, I was at Sourcing Journal covering the end-to-end fashion supply chain for 7 years. So pretty familiar. And even before that, I used to work in the industry. So
I caught all that, and I was curious to start. Thank you first for providing us with the context, but interested to start first with what's attracted you to this particular perspective on fashion, being part of the media and in a journalist specifically. Why have you been inspired to pursue this particular perspective on fashion?
well, I mean, I think this is the realistic perspective on fashion. I think as much as it's an industry filled with a lot of beauty, there's a lot of less beautiful things that happen. And I think it's important for people to know about that. And it's important for the industry to address those things so that it can continue to be something that's positive.
Hmm, that's interesting. Could you say a bit more as to what you think is the role and relationship of media to the business and industry of fashion?
Certainly, well, as I mentioned, I used to work as a merchandiser. And at that time, it was part of my job to be one of the people pushing the factories in Bangladesh to make
Mm,
this thing cheaper every year, which is what my boss's job was doing. And of course, I'm supporting that. So when you see the prices that these things are being made for, and you're making millions of t-shirts for low priced stores, you realize the kind of impact you can have. And so for me, that's actually why I left the industry and didn't end up in media covering it on purpose, but because I did want to be a journalist and my background was in fashion, it ended up that way. So I think it's critically important. It's so much better for me personally to sit in this position and kind of talk about those issues than to be perpetuating them. So I think it's critically important for media not just to tell the stories, but to pay attention to the stories that need to be told. It's really easy to talk about the surface level of fashion, what's happening on the runways, who's wearing what the pretty fabrics are. But if we don't go deeper where the bulk of the industry is, then we're not doing our job as journalists. I think,
mm,
the media is probably covering a lot of fashion media could be guilty of covering, let's say, focusing 80% of their time on the pretty side of fashion and 20% or even less in some cases on the true underbelly of it. And I think we need to bring that into better balance because there's so many people and so many communities and environments that are impacted by what's going on in fashion that it isn't just about telling stories, it's about taking care of the people who are taking care of us.
and so from making that leap to working in fashion to then covering the industry of fashion, were there any surprises for you or learnings or new understandings? Like maybe you went in with some hypotheses and it either wasn't at all what you expected to look at the industry from that lens, or perhaps it was exactly like you expected?
I guess having had the experience I had working in the industry, I wasn't terribly surprised by what was going on. I think what was the most eye-opening was how rampant some of these problems are and how much factory workers, for example, suffer because
Mm,
of what we're doing further down in the supply chain. And I think the things that got to me the most were people's individual stories or realizing how these big companies are just raking in money and really not willing to pay more, and more being just a reasonable amount for the things that they're requesting to have made. So I think that was the biggest eye opener, how rampant this problem is and how the industry is built on being okay with it.
mm. And so at maybe a gut level, what's your feeling towards fashion, and how is that as an industry and how it's evolved maybe from your first day, your first years in covering it to now here as the executive editor at WWD?
It certainly hasn't evolved as much as we would like to think. One thing that is certainly more obvious is that these things are in the conversation much more than they were. Having come from sourcing journal, it's a niche publication that really is
Mm.
focused on the fashion supply chain. So I was living and breathing what's happening with the garment worker and feeling like when you're in that, you could feel like, oh, everyone's talking about this. Um, but having emerged from that into a more mainstream fashion publication, everyone is not talking about that. So I think now the conversations are there. People are addressing what's happening with garment workers more than they have in the past. So I think I'm hopeful that we're moving in the right direction. Just if we can move there a little more quickly, that would be great.
I'm sure many people agree with you here, many of our listeners as well. But so, from the perspective of the media and that of a journalist, maybe someone who sees more of the narrative lens on any sort of ecosystem, where do you see the industry of fashion right now, or what are the few particular, maybe it's the relationship with garment workers and supply chain specifically, but what are the few cornerstone topics, themes, and challenges that are set to shape and mold of fashion here in the immediate and near future?
Yeah, I think fashion's two biggest mandates are sustainability and social impact. I think those are the things that people need to be addressing widely and consistently. I think that the industry was set up like a lot of things have been set up over the years. These few people at the top, they make the money, they have the success, they have the fun. Their whole ability to do that is built on the backs of other people, and they're not taking care of those people. So when it comes to taking care of those people, it's not just paying them a decent wage, which many companies are not doing. But I was in Bangladesh for a factory visit some years ago and just driving between factories, and there's a river. The place looks beautiful on the surface, but there was a river there that was completely indigo, like completely indigo that you never seen anything like that in your life. And that's the only water stream in that community. Okay, we have jeans, but what's happening to the people who live there in that community where we're making the jeans and letting all these chemicals run into their drinking water? They're still drinking the water because that's what they have. It's just so much deeper than corporate social responsibility reports and following the certain few things that are legally required of you. It's you actually have to care about what you're doing and the people who are doing it for you and the environment that they live in and the earth and what's going to happen to that if we continue to just do what we're doing.
And so, what do you see as, for definition's sake, when you say sustainability in a more sustainable fashion industry? Well, what do you see as the end result there? Perhaps some examples, or what's the goal that those within the industry should be striving towards?
A great big question. I don't know if I can say what the end goal is because it's hard in an industry where you're going to continue to make product all the time.
Mm.
I think the immediate goal is how can we make less? How can we make more exactly to demand? How can we convince consumers to buy quality over quantity? And that shift is already beginning to happen. But how can we get back to the days of you buy one really nice coat and you have that coat for years and years? And then when you're done with it, you pass it on to someone else. So I think we have to focus on having a lesser impact from the outset. So can we use better materials? Can we use regenerative materials? Can we use processes that can give back to the earth in a positive way rather than just continuing to deplete from it? So we're starting with better products and then can make fewer good quality products and convince people to shop like that? And then can we have less waste? Can we pass clothing through circular models? Can we really broaden resale, reuse? And then can we figure out what to do with these things instead of just dumping them in the landfill? There are a lot of people working on things like this. Accelerating circularity is one of them, trying to figure out how to recycle more of the waste that we will ultimately end up having, no matter what, no matter how much we improve on some of the things I mentioned. So it's a lot of things. It's a lot of things, and it's a lot of dedication and a lot of people putting in hours and really their lives to figuring these things out. We really have to care. Brands have to care to find these people, find these solutions, engage them, pay for them.
And although it is quite the daunting task, and perhaps, as we mentioned earlier, we're not moving as fast as we'd like to. Do you feel hopeful? Do you still have a sense of hope and optimism for the change?
I do. I think I'm generally a hopeful person, and I guess I have had the privilege of seeing so many people who are really passionate about solving some of these problems, and they're just good. They're just fighting. We just need more people to feel like that, or more people to support them at the very least. But I do think people are thinking about everything that needs to be done with fashion. One of the main problems is that's a siloed effort right now. A lot of different people are thinking about a lot of different things. So some of the recent initiatives coming up are trying to get people to work more as a collective in the industry. And I think that's where we'll really move the needle. But I am hopeful that things will move in the right direction, even if it means we have laws and penalties for people to do what they need.
And it certainly seems like it's an all hands on deck sort of situation that we're in, and whatever levers will affect change, either if it's some sort of voluntary effort, or what, consumers decide to alter towards, or of course things that are obligatory. It's like all things that will provide solutions to where we need to go. Those should all be explored to the greatest potential, for sure.
Definitely.
But even in your definition of sustainability, or exploring what that means, it's interesting to note that it's all quite intertwined, anyways. We've conceptually separated the effects on the environment and the planet to be some conversation in sustainability, and that in social impact, or the human element, the effects on people, to be something different. But they're completely intertwined, especially in the context of, it's not sustainable for a business to be able to operate when the people working for it aren't making a living wage. Like, by definition, that seems unsustainable, because it's, like you mentioned, a group grossly benefiting or profiting off the unsustainable effort of others. So, in that mention of the like, there's a lot of silos working in fashion, and it seems as well the definition of what, it means to be sustainable in fashion. There's a lot of interconnectedness, and it seems like that's starting to be addressed, I think, and it sounds like you're noticing that too.
Yeah, I think for a long time, sustainability, and even now, was environmental.
Mhm.
Can we use less cotton? Can we use less water? Can we put out fewer emissions? Can we control the chemicals that are going into people's water streams? And all forgetting about the people who make all of that possible. So, certainly, if you are killing the environments of the people who work in the supply chain, and we all know the people who work in the supply chain are in remote parts of less developed countries, and that's not going to change unless companies are going to be willing to spend more for labor. So we can't just let these people waste away where they live and suffer and struggle to feed their families. It's so unethical. And I think if people were to really face, I think it's easy for companies to pretend like what's happening in the supply chain isn't directly related to them. Or if it's not in their face, it's like facing your demons. If you don't think about it too much, maybe it won't feel so bad. But When you see people and they can't buy shoes and they can't buy food and they're living 20 people to a small apartment, that's not right. Just so that you can have fashion, just so you can have another piece of clothing that you don't even actually need. It's really ugly if you think about what's actually happening. And sometimes it's a matter of cents. Some companies won't pay 10 cents more for something next year, even though the cost of living is going up and there's inflation. And it's like, why are we paying less for clothes now than we were paying for clothes 20 years ago? Nothing else is moving in that direction. Before fast fashion, you couldn't go into a store and get a t-shirt for $4.
Mm.
But everything's getting more expensive and the clothes are getting cheaper. That can't be the way that we continue to operate because we're literally starving people for that to be possible.
There's certainly a hidden cost to the cheap retail prices. And what do you think is going to affect those conditions for workers along the supply chain? You mentioned facing the demons. It must be easier to make decisions that might affect those folks' experience in a boardroom detached, from their day-to-day experience. But is there any sort of practical application of getting people to more so face those circumstances, perhaps the tragedies that are caused by that hidden cost that we're avoiding to pay?
In a perfect world, I would set it up like Undercover Boss, where the CEO of the big company would have to go to the factory and see the conditions and talk to the people. I'm not saying some of them don't do that. Some of them very well may. But I imagine those who do are probably changing the conditions in their supply chain.
Mm.
Um, but I would require that. I would make it so that the CEOs have to spend a day at least in the factory, eat with the people, talk to the people, understand what's happening in their personal lives. Because if you could then go home to your millions of dollars and sleep at night knowing how much a lot of these people are struggling, that would be its own problem. But I think most people would probably begin to be better at doing the right thing if they were face to face with the realities of what's happening in supply chain very often. I think the media has a good role to play in that. The more that we tell the stories of garment workers, the more that we expose companies who are refusing to pay for things that they ordered, like what happened when the pandemic hit and all the stores closed. Suddenly retailers were like, well, I'm not going to make any money and I don't have anywhere to put these clothes. So I'm not paying for them at all, or I'm not paying for them right now. And what happens is factories very often pay upfront for the raw materials to make the orders. So if a retailer decides, I don't want it, what then happens to the factory? They're just out that money. Or if a retailer decides, I'm not paying for it in the 90 days that we agreed on, I'll pay for it sometime 6 months from now. But they're relying on that money for salaries. I think the more that we talk about these things that are happening and shed light, the bad actors, then we can begin to change the story. I think the more countries start to pay attention to these things and put legislation in place to protect, firstly, to require a legal wage, and then to protect non-compliance with paying for orders that you place and things like that, that's when we'll start to see some of this really change. And some of that is already happening, to be fair. But I think it needs to happen consistently and it needs to happen in a way that it's not up to each company and the factories just have to deal with however good people are going to be to them.
It's tremendously difficult. I think what you spoke to there of perhaps the companies who are the ones. It's like the companies are focusing most on sustainability or the general human welfare. And those are the people who are perhaps already doing the most, visiting the factories. It's this divide of the extremes of people who are very committed and driven to running their business in a sustainable and equitable way. those people are probably already in the factories and have close relationships with them, in contrast to perhaps the other side. But I'd be curious, what do you see with the consumer perception or consumer vigilance as it relates to these issues, both the environmental component as well as the human element? Are there elements of that are changing or trending one way or another? Are consumers becoming more vigilant and changing any behavior? I know preferences are changing, but preferences and actions are a little bit different. I'd be curious to see what you think about this change or shift, if any.
Yeah, I definitely think things are changing. I think the first thing that's good is that consumers are becoming more aware of what goes into making their clothing. And that's the first step because once you know what's
Mm.
happening, then you can decide, hey, I'm okay with this or I'm not okay with this. And I think particularly Gen Z and the cohort that will come up behind them, they're really interested in equity, environmentalism, fairness, really that we need consumers to care about. So as they grow into having more disposable income and things like that, I think they will act with their values, meaning stop shopping at businesses where they don't support their values or where they feel like that business isn't transparent enough about how they're dealing with their supply chain. Um, I think the reality is that people are almost always going to shop based on what they like. I once sat in a conference on sustainable cotton, a conference on sustainable fashion, but a breakout room on sustainable cotton, organic cotton. And these are people who are advocates for sustainability. This is what they do for a living. It's like the sustainable person at X brand or the person who deals with sustainable materials at whatever brand. And the person presenting asked them, this was a room of probably about 20 people, asked them, how many of you are wearing organic cotton? And no one raised their hand. We have to really practice what we preach, not just the people who are in the rooms fighting for these sustainable improvements every day, but are we actually acting in what we think is the best interest of the industry? In many cases, no. But what that also means is that more brands just need to start doing things sustainably. It can't be that there are sustainable brands and they have their product, and then there are brands that are not sustainable and they have their products that are made in whatever questionable circumstances. Because ideally, I should be able to choose anything that I would like to wear and have it be sustainable. And what that also means is we need scale for some of these solutions so that the costs can be comparable and that it's
Mm.
not like, okay, I only have 20 bucks. Am I going to buy this t shirt or am I going to, like I should be able to make that choice. But if it's twice the price for the same thing because it's sustainable, then that will take away the choice from some people and from the money that they have to spend on clothing.
All Well, it seems like there's a necessary or an inherent tipping point that perhaps would occur if sustainability, as all its different little sub metrics and qualifications and criteria, was the bare minimum for what would allow a fashion brand to put something on the shelf. Then it seems like incentives would align. This is a term that the business community is quite obsessed with and enthralled with, the term of incentives. If they had no other option but to choose, say, for example, organic cotton versus conventional, perhaps very innovative minds would work on making that process as efficient and cost effective as possible. It's if we could only use solar to provide our energy, there's a reason that solar is getting cheaper and cheaper over the years, but it is something that gains more on an exponential curve once it needs to become the norm as opposed to it's voluntary. So it seems like you said, hitting some level of scale would be the thing that would start to make perhaps more sustainable fashion more approachable and accessible. And it's all so many of these things are so related because likewise the wage conversation too comes in. We're so comfortable with paying low wages, even in the United States relative to what our cost of living is. If we paid more appropriate wages, maybe consumers would have more spending power. and goods wouldn't seem so astronomically on one way or the other, either tremendously cheap or perhaps excessively expensive. So again and again, it's all so related.
Yeah, it really actually has a lot to do with brands coming out of pocket more. As much as they don't
Mm,
like to hear that, because many brands will decide, okay, we want sustainability. We want you to have water filtration, or we want you to have cleaner emission, whatever, meaning this is how they're talking to the factories. So they're like,
mm,
these are the requirements for us to continue to do business with you. Go. And they're not paying the factories to invest in some of these things. So what happens is, in some cases, factories can afford it and they'll do it, and they'll benefit both by being cleaner and getting the business they were promised, or they'll cut corners and
mm,
say, yes, it is sustainable. It
mm,
is what you asked for, which is not where we want to be. But it's really, again, unfair. Factories have so much money. They have people to pay, and they're not paying them a lot. And brands are continuing to make more and more money because they're selling sustainable products for higher prices. And you're actually going to go to the factory and be like, invest in this. Hopefully, you can find the money. And there are brands that don't operate like that at all. There are brands that are like, you are our partner. You have been working with us for a long time. We want to continue this relationship. We are going to invest in this machinery and we want you to use it. Or let's go half on this machinery and we want you to use it. And that'll be in a case where, for example, the brand does not own that factory. That factory produces for multiple brands, but one who is passionate about this may say, we'll invest in it or we'll pay half. Those are the people who actually really care. And those are the people who will make a difference. But the industry needs more relationships like that, more people like that.
I guess to perhaps point them out, if you could, are there some of those bright spots that you wouldn't mind sharing, like some of the brands or organizations that you feel particularly inspired by in their work in that regard?
Yeah, I'll name a current one because there's been so many stories over the years without going back into some of my notes. I don't want to misspeak. But Unless Collective, they are working on being fully zero waste. And the leaders over there are really thinking of everything. Eric Leidka is one of the leaders over there. He was former Adidas executive. It's like thinking about how to have zero waste shoelaces or zero waste bindings for your hoodie. So all of those things, how can you figure out how to make them less wasteful? How can you figure out how to make them out of biodegradable materials and things like that? So that's very interesting. I think one person who I'm really interested in is Shelley Zhu. She is um, working on zero waste design. So even before all of that, she'll sketch a pattern that doesn't have any waste in it. So you could draw a dress, right? And you need this main piece and you need to draw the sleeve and the bodice and whatever the pieces are. I'm not a pattern maker, but it's like a puzzle. And usually you put that together and there's spaces in between. And then you'll put that pattern down on a stack of fabric and cut it. But all those pieces in between are waste. So what she's doing is designing it so that all the pieces touch, that there's no waste at all. So it requires an innovative way of thinking, but she's eliminating waste before it can even happen. So I think that's something that's very interesting because the more that we can think about these things sooner, the better we're going to end up. So there are people who are really going deep into the whole process and thinking about that and figuring out how to put everything back into their system. There was a shoe brand
Mm,
from Brazil that I can't remember now, but they were making shoes and they have a lifetime guarantee on the shoes. So buy a shoe and then it falls apart. You bring it back and they'll give you another one. But what they do with the old one is they break it down and they use it now to make the sole of a new shoe. So everything is staying in their system. And because it's a small brand, relatively local, they're able to recollect those things from consumers. But the people who are thinking about all of that before they
Mm.
begin, before they make a product, before they sell it, how they're going to reclaim it, how they're going to repurpose it, those are the people who are really innovative.
I'm with you on that, and there's examples that span industry to industry of where these folks are starting in the design phase, both for, it seems, the supply chain, the specific product, the business model itself. If we have these obligatory bare minimum measures of paying people the way in which they should be paid, making products in a way that is hopefully regenerative and restorative to the ecosystems and environments affected, they're starting with that non-negotiable from the very beginning. And certainly they're able to figure it out. We just have to make sure that those are the constraints that we decide with or decide to start with. It seems it is quite the behemoth of a challenge to have these much larger fast fashion brands, as an example, start to, reverse and do things differently from what they've done, and as well what's seemed to produce the excessive amount of success and wealth for them. So it's harder for them to stop that engine, it seems, than
Totally.
for
It's
yeah.
like turning around, someone gave me the analogy once. It's like turning around a big ship in the ocean. That takes a long time.
Mm,
For new brand, it's easy because they're like, this is how I'm going to build from the ground up. Everything's going to be sustainable. Now, big brands that have been in business for 20, 30, 50 years, they have processes in place, they have
mhm.
partners, they have things they've only done a certain way since the beginning of time. So it's like, how do you undo all of that? How do you build it back better? For lack of anyway, how do you build it back in a way that's more what it needs to be? You have to be willing to spend more money. You have to be willing to undo some of the investments that you've made that are no longer good. You have to be willing to retrain people on a new process. I mean, you have to really be invested both mentally and financially to make it happen because it's a complete business model overhaul.
Mhm. Yeah, it's there, and there is the thing that there are very exceptional, innovative people working within a lot of these large brands. It is just the balance of what is the existing giant conglomerate that already exists, and the people who are the bright spots that are really working to, like you said, turn that ship. Big ship in the middle of the ocean. I would like to transition a little bit and focus as well to another important project that you've started, the diversity list, which you started in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. I'd love if you could introduce us briefly to that project, what it is, and why as well you started it, given that moment in time in 2020.
When George Floyd was killed, there was a lot going on. There were a lot of feelings, a lot of reactions, but just dealing with it from the perspective of how brands reacted, it was off-putting for a lot of people because it was brands who had never shown or claimed to support any marginalized communities, or they did so for some marketing campaign here and there. And suddenly they were like, we support the Black community, we support this, and we're doing this. And do you support the Black community? So, what does your organization look like? And I started asking that question myself in seeing all the Black squares that these companies were posting on Instagram. And I had a conversation with a colleague who is the co creator of the diversity list, Selena Tang. And I was trying to say it would be great to have all of us in one place. And she built that place. Um, so it it was a personal project for she and I, and we did all of the research ourselves and built the site ourselves, and just were kind of pulling from CSR reports and things that companies were posting about their diversity. to see, okay, what does this company really look like? And so we thought if we could have all the major fashion companies listed there, then consumers would have the ability to determine what kind of company they want to support. What does that company look like? And taking that a step further, and with not just the executive team, we looked at the executive team, the overall company diversity, and boards of directors. And it was really hard to find the information. It was really
Mm,
hard. Some companies are forthcoming about it. Some companies posted some of the data because of the momentum, the pressure that was building after George Floyd was killed. So we used some of that. Some of it is like you have to dig into a corporate social responsibility report, which you can't find easily on the website. And then you have to dig through that report to find it on one little tiny page. It's almost like most of these companies really don't want you to find that
mm.
information, which is not transparent or the way that it should be. So that's what we were trying to do. And I think the way that Selena was able to think about its presentation, I think was really good. We reduced it down to if this company were 100 people, what would it look like? So people wouldn't have to think about math and anything like that and just see what the representation was or is. It was a huge work in process, a huge undertaking that both of us were doing on the side of our regular day jobs. So it is in desperate need of updating because companies have made some progress, I think, in terms of their representation. There's a long way to go. There's a long way to go
Mm.
because companies weren't going to suddenly fire a bunch of non-diverse people and hire new ones. So it's like within those open positions, some of them were filled by diverse candidates, some of them were not. The way companies have changed is very small. It's going to take time, but I think that people need to be able to see who they're working with. And I think companies need to be clear about their representation. It cannot be that something that I knew how to find because I'm a journalist. It should
Mm.
be something that anyone can find. And there's a certain area of the investor relations portion of their website that you have to look to find who the boards of directors are. On some websites, it's easier than others, but that should be easy to find. It should be easy to find. It should be in one place. Everyone should know what the deal is. And so that's really where that came from. And the connection is great.
I think what you say there is it speaks to the importance of putting these conversations into as objective terms as we can. Like, what are the numbers, the facts, and the figures? Because in the context of companies claiming to be sustainable or products being sustainable, it's like more objectively, what does that mean? And it's worthwhile to define because sustainability has become a quite a popular term. Diversity has become a more popular term. But what actually does that look like in practice? And how can we put that into as objective terms as possible? Yes or no? And then therefore, given the answer, what are we going to do about that? And what does real progress look like? So I appreciate that so much about what you've done with the diversity list. And I will certainly second it's extremely well laid out, very clear and visually easy to interpret the results that y'all found. So we'll of course have that linked up. Um,
Thank you.
you mentioned some progress being made. What are some things that brands are doing, folks within the industry that are making some progress, as you mentioned? What are they doing right in approaching their level of representation?
I think the main thing that they're doing right is putting in place people who care about this. So a lot of companies, their first effort was to hire a chief diversity officer. There's high turnover in that role for I'm sure a number of reasons. I think probably primarily because a lot of companies will hire those people and not integrate them, not actually take their suggestions, not actually make the necessary changes, which I'm sure can be entirely frustrating for the people who are tasked with making that change. So the people who are doing it right, they have employed and empowered somebody who cares and somebody who knows how to make the changes. Progress has been low. But the people who are doing it right are looking at all layers of what needs to change. So someone I spoke to, well, a lot of people are having affinity groups and things like that. But those who are successful are making those affinity groups sit with the C-suite and tell them what the
Mm,
problems are and why they're problems. The people who are successful are going as deep as looking at language within the review process. And there are words that people would use for women that they wouldn't use for men. So
mm,
it's training your leadership to probe that. Oh, why did you say that about that person? Give me an example of how they showed that characteristic or didn't show that characteristic. So they've eliminated some terms from being able to be used in the review process because they're too objective and because they're objective in a way that is skewed in favor of men. So
mm,
they're thinking about all of these things because obviously the review process is what leads to promotion. So that is also how they empower people within their organization to rise up because it isn't always about looking outside and saying we need more Black people, we need more people from the LGBTQ community. What about the people who work here, the people who have already been contributing to the organization? Can I pay more attention to them? Can I see what their career goals and aspirations are? And can I support that and empower that and lift them up if that's the direction they want to go in? So I think the people who are being successful are digging into all the layers of this issue
mm.
to root out systemic bias, systemic default behaviors, and bring balance to it all. So if you have things set up in an equitable way, then you can start to hire and continue to hire in an equitable way and continue to promote people in an equitable way and then continue to see changes at your executive level, see more people represented there. And sometimes you have to fast track opportunity. Sometimes you have to make space for people who might not have, you might not have just made space for because voices need to be represented and because they didn't have the same opportunity as one of their counterparts. For I know there are a lot of nuances, and I'm not the expert in this area, but there are a lot of experts in this area, and a lot of them are doing really good work at big brands. And the brands that are going to be the most successful are the ones who are really committed to seeing this change, who are really asking the tough questions so they can change themselves and change the corporate culture, and who are answering the tough questions so they can be held accountable to the people who work for them and the people who shop with them.
It certainly seems like the brands who are investing in the infrastructure to see the system actually changed versus, as you mentioned, maybe a chief diversity officer being planted but not having a department or any sort of resources or team to work with. So it seems like there's a lot of different ways in which it can seem more so as just, okay, what's the first reaction or impulsive reaction they take to appease what is this call and this demand versus who are the people that are seriously looking at shifting the direction that ship is sailing once again. I really appreciate your time here and thank you so much for joining me. Before we wrap up, you mind if I ask you a few rapid fire questions?
Love rapid fire.
All right. So first off, what's a book or maybe a film that has impacted you recently or something that you always come back to that you might recommend to our listeners? Can be about subjects we discuss here or not at all.
Right now, I'm in a season of reading fashion coffee table books, which may sound to some not real literature. However, it is part of learning more about the front end of fashion since I've been so invested in the back end and the supply chain. And one that I love is about Bonnie Cashin. Her archivist, Stephanie Lake, wrote the book. She was a designer, very popular in the 50s and 60s, but she was really in the belief of not going with the masses, not going into this big machine that is the fashion industry. Wildly talented, wildly successful, turned down a lot of big brands that wanted to work with her. She worked for Hermes for a time. She was the first designer for Coach. So a lot of the staple bags that the Coach brand has came from her designs. But she was steadfast in kind of running a smaller business, one that wasn't filled with waste and one that wasn't excessive and one that was about really creating beautiful things for the people who would keep them for a lifetime. And I mean, she hasn't been designing, she passed away years ago, and her stuff is still coveted, on resale sites and vintage houses and things like that. So they last. Coats that she made in the 50s are still good and still wanted and still stylish. So I think, you know, hers is a model that I think more people in the industry would embrace because we don't need a million brands making a million products. We need just enough really good quality brands led by people who are really passionate about the product that they're creating and where the materials come from and who they're supporting and making products that consumers will love and keep for a long time.
I love that. Next one for you. Are you a New Year's resolution person? And if so, do you have any this year for
I am
2022?
not a New Year's resolution person. I am a goals for the year person. And I guess,
Mm,
to be honest, I did not set any goals this year because it feels like we went inside in 2019 and we haven't come back out yet. So I feel like
mm.
right now, if I can be healthy and happy, I have won. So those are my focuses right now, and that the people who I love are healthy and happy. That's my main goal for this.
So maybe you'll be setting yourself up for success.
Yeah,
I
I think so.
sure hope. Next one for you. Do you have any morning routines or daily habits that you have to stick to,
Mm,
if any at all?
such a good question. It's definitely a different answer in the pandemic than
Hmm.
outside of the pandemic, but I have a little book that I have some kind of mantras and reminders in and things remind me to be patient, to be positive. And I read that every morning before I allow myself to touch my phone. I read through the whole thing and it helps center me. It helps remind me the behavior that I need to adopt all the time, but also for that day. It helps settle me if I've woken up frustrated or sad or anything that isn't positive. And I try to reframe my perspective and go into the day in the best way that
That sounds like a nice way to start the day. I often start way too soon touching my phone and looking at news, as I'm sure so many people do. So that sounds like a more fulfilling, a wholesome way to approach the world.
it's
One
good.
one final question for you. What's one bit of advice that you might leave our listeners with? These folks are change makers, social entrepreneurs working to leave the world a better place than they found it.
I would pay attention to small brands. I think
Mm,
they're so innovative and so creative, and every day I discover a new brand doing something cool. And I think both if we can support them, it's a benefit to us because we'll have better, more interesting things in our closets, but they'll also be able to continue doing what they're doing. And they're the ones changing the game. They're the ones thinking about the people who make the product. They're the ones thinking about the environment. They're the ones thinking about waste and how to have less of it. And I think everyone wins if we put an eye on some of these smaller brands.
excellent advice to end on. That's a thread that comes up quite a bit in our conversations. The folks who are small is beautiful, especially in the context of investing in communities and products and relationships with the end consumer. Tara, thank you so much for taking the time. Before we finish out, where should folks keep up with you? Where would you like to direct them to?
They can definitely find me on WWD. I do write stories still from time to time. That's the most productive place, and I do post some of my stories on LinkedIn.
All right. We'll have all things linked up in our show post at socialentrepreneurship.fm. Thanks again, Tara.
Thanks for having me, Corey. Appreciate it.